The Yellow Wallpaper is a classic short story and was highly controversial at the time of its publishing. This was due to the fact it was written by a woman, as well as the fact that it portrayed the men in the story as being unhelpful and actually contributing to the main character's mental decline. Shocking, right? The piece and its author, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, have a long history tied closely to the suffragette movement and feminism as a whole. It also helped convince doctors to stop treating women's mental health issues with the rest treatment. The story was loosely based on Gilman's mental breakdown years prior, with some embellishments. In 1877, she went to see a physician because she was having issues with an unspecified nervous disorder. After making her take bed rest and concluding, wrongly, that there was nothing wrong with her, her doctor had ordered her to live as domestic a life as possible and have at most 2 hours a day of mental activity. This was a common treatment at the time. He also ordered Gilman to never write again. As the doctor's advice led her to become more and more unwell, after talking with a friend, she decided to stop following his prescription. She quit following the doctor's plan only 3 months after she began. In 1892, The Yellow Wallpaper was published in New England magazine. Once published, she sent a copy to the doctor who told her to stop writing. Later on, he admitted to a group of his close friends that reading her story caused him to alter how he treated neurasthenia, the diagnosis at the time for mental issues related to nervousness. Now, mind you, I'm leaving a heck of a lot out. That was about the shortest I could cut the real-life story behind The Yellow Wallpaper. It's fascinating stuff, really. But that's not what we're talking about today, as you probably already knew. We're talking about the literary devices it used. Also shocking, right? Don't worry, I'll stop saying that now. Anyways, for those who haven't read the story, The Yellow Wallpaper is the story of a woman named Jane, a woman diagnosed with neurasthenia, who is staying in a rental house under the orders of her husband, John, who is a physician. She's not to cook, clean, or do any sort of work, and instead get plenty of rest and fresh air. She's barely allowed to write, but keeps a journal in secret, that journal being the story we're reading. The bedroom where she and John sleep is located on the top floor of the house and is the former nursery. That nursery has the titular yellow wallpaper, which is as ugly as can be. It's full of lines going in every which direction and seems to morph in depending on the lighting. Since Jane has nothing else to focus on, she slowly becomes obsessed with the wallpaper, trying to figure out its pattern. As she starts hallucinating women crawling through the yard, she becomes convinced that there are two patterns in the wallpaper, one being the woman trapped inside, the other being the mess of lines that keeps them from climbing out at night. She tears off part of the wallpaper while her husband is away on an overnight case. The day he's scheduled to return, she locks herself in the room, telling the staff that she's planning to sleep all day. She then throws the key out the window, tears off as much of the wallpaper as she can, and begins crawling around on the floor in a set route along the wall. John returns and tries to get into the room. He's unsuccessful and almost gets an axe before Jane tells him where the key is. Upon opening the door, he is shocked to find his wife crawling around. He asks her what she's doing, but at this point Jane isn't Jane anymore. She's the lady from the wallpaper. John faints in the doorway, and Jane continues crawling along without changing her route, and simply crawls over his body. Now, we, as the readers, cannot be sure what's really going on. Is Jane possessed by the lady in the wallpaper, or was it her husband's orders, leaving her with nothing to do but obsess over and analyze the god-awful wallpaper, driving her insane? Well, knowing the real-life story that inspired Gilman to write the piece makes it pretty clear what the author intended. But not knowing that background and stumbling across it for the first time in a magazine in 1892? Well, the opening paragraph tells us that the house was offered for rent cheaply and that it has a long history. What exactly that history was remains unclear, but it is mentioned that there was some dispute over who would inherit the house. From the beginning, Jane says there's something that feels off about the house. If you were reading the story for the first time with no context or knowledge of Gilman's real-life struggles, you can make a strong case for the lady behind the wallpaper being some sort of ghost or demon. On the other hand, we know from the beginning that Jane is mentally unwell. That brings us to the subject at hand, an unreliable narrator. The term unreliable narrator was first coined in 1961 by Wayne C. Booth, but it has been used as a plot device for centuries. The simple version is this: a narrator who tells a story with a lack of credibility. One of the earliest examples of an unreliable narrator would be George Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, as the wife in The Wife of Bath often misquotes while telling her story. Allow me to narrate an excerpt from... Whoa! Just looking at that makes my head hurt. Okay, I'm going to read a modernized version of the story instead. The Roman poet Ovid tells the story of King Midas in his collection of tales. Midas had donkey ears growing out of his head, and he hid them with his long hair so well that no one except his wife knew they were there. He loved her and trusted her very much and begged her not to tell anyone about his funny ears. Midas's wife swore up and down that she'd never tell anyone about her husband's donkey ears. At the same time, though, she thought she'd die from having to keep such a juicy secret bottled up inside her forever. It seemed as if this secret was so strong it would burst out of her unless she could release it. But since she'd promised her husband she wouldn't tell anyone, she ran down to the lake, put her lips to the water, and said, "Don't tell anyone what I'm about to tell you. You, and you alone, will hear my secret. My husband has the ears of a donkey. Okay, I've said it, and I feel much better because of it. I just couldn't stand it any longer." You can read all about it in Ovid's Metamorphoses if you want to know the rest of the story. The problem with the wife's statement is that anyone who read Ovid's poem knows that it was Midas's barber who revealed the king had donkey ears. He, to conceal the scandal of the deed, a purple turban folds about his head, veils the reproach from public view, and fears the laughing world would spy his monstrous ears. One trusty barber slave that used to dress his master's hair when lengthened to excess, the mighty secret knew, but knew alone, and, though impatient, durst not make it known. Rustled at last a private place be found, then dug a hole and told it to the ground. In a low whisper he revealed the case, and covered in the earth, and silent left the place. In time of trembling reeds a plenteous crop, from the corn-fighted furrow sprouted up, which, high advancing with the ripening year, made known the tiller and his fruitless care, for then the rustling blades and whispering wind tell the important secret both combined. That would be a translation of Ovid's original Latin work, translated by, those guys. Now that, of course, does not validate the rest of the wife's story. The wife drones on and on throughout her piece in Canterbury about various subjects, at various points quoting the Bible to help justify her beliefs. In this case, her unreliability is used for comedic effect. It's not a case where she's trying to deceive the reader, she's just wrong about some things and right about others. Here's another example I just made up where the narrator is aware they have no idea what they're talking about. The church had been there for years, I think. I can't be sure. I've only lived in the town for 3 years, and the neighborhood for 6 months. The church sure looks ancient, but then again, what do I know about architecture? I'm a psych major, after all, not a psychic. I've also never been inside. In this case, the narrator is aware they're unreliable and are telling the reader. I also think it's funny. That aside, these examples complicate the definition of an unreliable narrator. Aren't all narrators in some way unreliable? Aren't they all biased? If they knew something would happen, but they left it out intentionally as not to spoil the ending, doesn't that technically count as lying to the reader? What if the character themselves was lied to? A few things. First, the term unreliable narrator is typically used to refer to someone who is mentally unwell, a child who doesn't understand what's really happening, or someone purposely reading the reader astray. The first and last can sometimes coincide, as well as have something in common. They're both almost always written in the first person, and often as a fictional journal or some other fictional record, for example, a fictional incident report. In the Yellow Wallpaper, the journal serves as a chronicle of Jane's descent into yellowy madness. In a more recent example, parts of the book Gone Girl are pieces of the character Amy's journal. As we later learn, the journal was created by her to point the blame at her husband Nick for her disappearance, including fabricated allegations of abuse and fear. By the way, spoiler alert, if you're thinking, wow, Amy sounds like a jerk, you'd be right, but her husband did cheat on her with one of his students, so I understand why she's angry. Framing him for murder was a tad overkill, though, especially when a divorce would have done the job. But what do I know? I'm a high school student, not a psychic. That said, we don't know Amy's journal is a lie until the story is narrated from her point of view instead of her husband's. It's written very realistically, or so I'm told. I'm a bit unreliable in this matter myself, as I haven't read the book. Regardless, Jane's journal is also written very realistically, up until the very end. And that brings us to the subject of literary realism. Literary realism is defined as a style of writing in which the goal is to represent things as they are in reality. Usually it's written from the perspective of someone in the lower or middle class, and it doesn't sugarcoat things. It's not about making things dramatic or having a happy ending. For example, a fictional journal chronicling someone's events as they live through a historic event, or go insane because of wallpaper. There's really no difference. Literary realism first became popular in France and Russia during the 19th century. Or maybe it was always popular in Russia. They like sad politic books and getting drunk off potatoes. Maybe all their folktales are just people having sad politics and the occasional angry bear. But I digress. Using the real-life story behind the Yellow Wallpaper, we can determine that the story is meant to be a realistic portrayal of what it's like to be mentally ill. And for the most part, it succeeds, right up until the end. As I mentioned, the story ends with Jane crawling around the room over and over, going right over her husband. But it's written as if she's chronicling these things as they happen. Is she just writing in her journal while she shuffles around on her knees? For example, I suppose I shall have to get back behind the pattern when it comes night, and that is hard. It is so pleasant to be out in this great room and creep around as I please. I don't want to go outside. I won't, even if Jenny asks me to. For outside you have to creep on the ground, and everything is green instead of yellow. But here I can creep smoothly on the floor, and my shoulder just fits in that long smooch around the wall, so I cannot lose my way. Why, there's John at the door. It's no use, young man, you can't open it. How he does call and pound! Now he's crying for an axe. I'd be ashamed to break down that beautiful door. But then, immediately after that, it's as if she's writing after some time has passed. John, dear, said I in the gentlest voice, the key is down by the front steps, under a plantain leaf. That silenced him for a few moments. Then he said, very quietly indeed, Open the door, my darling. I can't, said I. The key is down by the front door, under a plantain leaf. And then I said it again, several times, very gently and slowly, and said it so often that he had to go and see, and he got it, of course, and came in. He stopped short by the door. What is the matter? He cried. For God's sake, what are you doing? I kept on creeping just the same, but I looked at him over my shoulder. I've got out last, said I, in spite of you and Jane, and I've pulled off most of the wallpaper, so you can't put me back. Now why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time. It sounds less like a journal at that point and more like a traditional story. Granted, it's meant to be from the perspectives of someone who's mentally unbalanced, but overall, I'd say the constant tense and tone changes at the end hurt the Yellow Wallpaper's presentation. That's the thing with literary realism. You have to be careful when to use it. It's like strawberries. Yeah, they're great with pancakes or ice cream, but don't you dare put that in my spaghetti. The only fruit that belongs in spaghetti is tomato, and even then only in the sense that it's biologically a fruit and not in the culinary fruit group. For an example of literary realism done right, author Jack London used his real-life experience during the Yukon Gold Rush to write his most famous books, Call of the Wild and White Fang, as well as most of his short stories. He actually based the main character of Call of the Wild on a dog he met, also named Buck. And I know this goes without saying, but good boy, Buck! Another example of literary realism being used to great effect is The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. The book is about a young Union soldier named Henry, just trying to survive the American Civil War. Although Crane did not live through the Civil War, many veterans who read the book said it was exactly like what they lived through. It wasn't casting judgment on anyone, it was just trying to portray the truth. And that's when you should use strawberries, to portray the truth. Like when Gilman wanted to expose the truth behind doctors' treatment of women. Boom. Boom. Boom.